this was obviously more of a strategic growth opportunity that Harvest Host was looking for. I knew they had just taken a bunch of funding. They had announced a $37 million round only a few months prior to that. So, I mean, I knew they had a bunch of money to spend, and the reason for their purchase was they had, about 3,000 winery hosts, and I knew that they would essentially want to add our hosts to that mix in some way to essentially increase their footprint. So it was definitely a strategic buy. So I knew that, our multiple would be able to be substantially bigger than that. 3 to 4.
Yeah, it's interesting when a strategic acquirer, a company you think has a really good, a good rationale to buy your company, raises a truckload of money, like $37 million. I think there's sort of two things that can happen. One is that they've got a war chest to go buy your business, which clearly you hoped and thought that Joel was clearly coming to you thinking, with that intent. The other side, though, is that they've got a war chest to compete with you. And if you don't nibble on the offer, it could mean that, okay, fine, well, the gloves are off. We're going to go do something on our own to compete with you. Did that cross your mind that Joel would take that $37 million and create his own version of Boondockers Welcome? Welcome to another edition of Built to Sell Radio, the podcast designed to help you punch above your weight in a negotiation to sell your company. I'm your host, John Warlow. Today on the show, we're going to hear from Anna Maste, who turned down an offer of 3.9 times ARR, annual recurring revenue, in 2019, only to get a whole lot more in 2021. She'll talk about how she did that. Before we get there, though, I just want to make sure you can nominate a guest for Built to Sell Radio. Some of our best episodes, like Anna, are from people like you who nominate business owners who've sold a company. So I'd love for you to think about who you might want to nominate, a business owner who you think is a story worth sharing with our community. Just go to builttosell.com/nominate. And while you're on Built to Sell, you'll also see the show notes for Anna's episode. We're making a marked improvement in how we approach our show notes. So there you'll see references to all of the things we talk about on today's show, some of the other guests in the past that we reference, and also some definitions of some of the lingo and technical terms which may be new to you, all at builttosell.com. So check that out. But first, we got to go to Anna Maste, because this is a real kind of master class in bootstrapping a two-sided market. We're going to talk about one way you can increase your revenue with one simple decision right now. How to overcome the fear of making your first hire, something I know a lot of people feel queasy about. How to leverage Facebook groups to grow your business organically. How to know when an acquirer has the means to buy your business. How to bootstrap the growth of a two-sided market. Accelerate word of mouth. Avoid one of the biggest causes of strife in a family business. Increase your prices without causing churn. Replace yourself inside your business and find your next great employee. Here to tell you all about it is Anna Maste. Anna Maste, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks, John. I'm really excited to be here.
Boondockers Welcome. Okay, I'll bite. What on earth does this company do?
So Boondockers Welcome is a platform for RVers to connect with other like-minded people who will let you camp on their private property for a night or two for free. So
this is like Airbnb for RVs. Am I getting it? The analogy right?
You're in the right ballpark. So there are a couple other companies like HipCamp that are sort of on that Airbnb model where you pay to rent somebody's private property. Boondockers Welcome works on more of a couch surfing model where cool. Hosts are actually voluntarily letting people stay for free. And most of them are RVers or former RVers themselves. And they're more in it for the social aspect. The RV community tends to be quite tight-knit. They form very fast friendships, and they really enjoy each other's company. And that's part of why people RV. And so this sort of online community just became a natural extension of that.
My wife has this secret fantasy about renting an RV and driving all across the US. Like we always talk about it. I've never done it, and she always talks about it. So one day I'm going to have to become an RVer. Now, but this is horribly stereotypical, but my sense is RVers are a little bit older, and maybe the interaction with other people, the community building, that's, especially if you live in a rural area, it's probably nice to actually have some other interaction with human beings every once in a while. Am I getting into the headspace a little bit?
Yeah, you're right. I would say the average Boondockers Welcome host is, either retired or semi-retired, and has a, more rural property, although there are a bunch of hosts who, have urban driveways. My own, downtown driveway is not very big, but you can come park your small Class B sort of camper van sized RV in my driveway for a night. But the majority of our hosts are probably of that age, partly because that tends to be the age where people actually have property big enough to host anybody.
Yeah, the time to drive around.
Yeah, but the average guest the age of the average guest has decreased significantly in the last 10 years, right?
And of course, the pandemic just threw jet fuel on this whole industry, right?
100%.
Yeah.
So, there was already a movement for people to, stop working their office jobs and go remote. And that just happened tenfold more frequently in the pandemic.
Yeah. Wow. So what's the business model? Like, how do you make money doing this?
The guests pay an annual membership. So it's currently $50 a year to have access to all of the hosts. And like I said, the hosts don't accept any money unless some of them will offer an electric hookup, in which case it is common courtesy to compensate them for their out-of-pocket costs. But the Boondockers Welcome as a business, our business model is essentially providing the service for the guests. So they pay an annual membership fee to the company.
How did you land on that as a business model?
The other options, the pay-per-night model has a very different feel to it. Plus, there's a lot of logistics, both for a company and for a host, that you have to jump through. All of a sudden, the hosts are running a business. They have to, claim that on their taxes. They have to make sure that their insurance covers that. Whereas, the idea of inviting other RVers to come stay on your property was something that already happened all the time in the RV industry. They, people would meet and hand out cards saying, "Oh, if you're ever in my neck of the woods, come stay in my driveway." So it's a very easy guest to have, an RVer who pulls up and you don't have to do anything, right? Except maybe run them an extension cord. So most hosts wouldn't even consider taking money. So that wasn't really an option for us from a business model perspective. The other option would have been sort of, an advertising supported model. And that wasn't really something that was in our wheelhouse at all, and not something that I was really interested in learning. And it took off. It's pretty easy for people to justify spending $50 a year for what could be, an endless supply of hosts. And there are almost 3,000 hosts right now across North America. So a lot of options for that $50.
And how many members?
When we sold, we had about 12,000 annual members, traveling members.
And what do they get for that? Like, is it a mobile app that they use, or is it a desktop, like web browser?
So for a long time, we only had a web browser app. And then shortly before we sold, we did finally release a mobile app as well. But it provided a whole experience allowing, once you had a paid membership, you could browse all of the hosts before even paying at that time. But once you paid, you could connect with hosts, request stays, very, Airbnb-like interface in that respect. And hosts could manage, any guests that they had. So we tried to provide a really good experience for that.
Yeah, this is a classic two-sided market, which once they're going, this is a license to print money. It's an amazing business model, but boy, it is tough to get going, because you've got to somehow keep the plates sort of circling in the air. You got to have enough hosts to make it worthwhile for the guy. And so how did you, I've got so many questions around that, but how did you get this thing off the ground? Because again, most two-sided markets have like tens of millions of dollars of VC money, and they have enough money to sort of get both sides of the market in place. But I'm so fascinated because you didn't have any of that.
No, we had a little bit of luck and timing and some good secret sauce, which was that my co-founder is my mother, who had been RVing for about probably 10 or 15 years by the time we started Boondockers Welcome. And she had sort of, to help pay the travel bills, started prior to Boondockers Welcome a e-travel guide that she had, her own website that she sold. They're called the Frugal Shunpiker Guides to RVing, sort of geared towards finding free camping on public land in the US. And there is a lot of it to be found, and some of it is beautiful and some of it is not. So she, had, a series of about 6 travel guides, and she had been selling those for, 5 or 7 years by the time we started Boondockers Welcome, and had a significant mailing list at that point of people who, were interested, who were RVers, and people who were the seed hosts for Boondockers Welcome. So that was really the thing that allowed us to start from nothing without a bunch of, venture funding in our back pocket.
Family businesses are always tricky. How did you deal with the equity split with your mom? Because first of all, she's your mom, so that's hard. not only that, she's come into this business with an asset, right? Because that's actually a significant asset, as you've just characterized. I mean, she had a mailing list, and not everybody has that. It took her years to develop. So how did you guys figure out who would take what split on the equity?
Yeah. So when she approached me with the idea, she was actually just looking for advice from me. I'm a computer engineer by trade. So she wanted to know, if she was thinking of outsourcing the building of the platform essentially, and wanted to get my take on how much it would cost and what, the best channels to find someone to do it would be. And I was, a little worried that she was going to pour her life savings into something that hadn't necessarily been fully vetted out. And again, being a computer engineer, I happened to be on maternity leave. And here in Canada, we're lucky enough to have 12 months of maternity leave. So I offered to use my maternity leave time she would come and spend time with her new grandson. And I built the business for her. So my technical skills essentially was my sweat equity. And we ended up with a 50-50 split.
So you bribed your mom to babysit your kid. Is that basically
I don't think there was any bribing going on there. I think it was win-win-win all around.
Okay, got it. Okay, so you went with a 50-50 split, even though she had the list, but you had this very rare skill set, the computer engineering and so forth. Got it. That makes sense. How quick was the trajectory here? Because again, my perception of two-sided markets is you kind of have to flip a switch and it has to just scale like overnight. Was that the case in your business? Like, did you guys just hit a switch, or what was it like? What was the journey like?
The truth is not at all. And partly because it was a side project for us for a very long time. Even after I went back to work, my maternity leave ended, I went back to work. I was still working a full-time job and had, eventually 2 kids at home. We didn't have the time or the money to throw into it. And it's a relatively low lifetime value product. It's hard as a non-venture backed company to throw a bunch of money into advertising to try and build up that two-sided marketplace. And as it turned out, the timing, I think it was still sort of early in the, fully connected road travel time frame. People were sort of just getting to the point where they, had, an iPad on the road all the time and were able to use that sort of platform. So nobody else was sweeping in underneath us to steal that from us. That first mover advantage that we had. And because of the business model that we chose, it wasn't an appealing business model to any sort of venture-backed company because it didn't scale based on the number of nights that people stayed, right? It was $50 per per user flat. That was it.
Did you ever entertain any conversations with the VC community or any sort of investors?
Towards the very end, sort of as the pandemic really peaked and RV travel really became very, very popular, we did have several investors reach out to, inquire about whether or not we were interested in taking on any funding. And that was not something that was really in my interests whatsoever.
I want to get to that. Specifically to the VCs who are reaching out, the investors who are reaching out, did you get a sense of their thesis, like what they would have done to your business model in order to make it more scalable? Like, would they have gone to the per night model, or did you get any sense of what they would?
No, we never really got far enough into the conversations, and I never really got enough indication of value that they would provide other than a bunch of money. And right. Yeah. The idea of trying to throw a bunch of rocket fuel on the company wasn't something that appealed to either my mother or I. We always ran the company with a very customer-centered focus. Our hosts, were essentially providing all of the value for us. And sounds therefore, good, yeah. It was imperative that we keep them as the top priority at all times. So, the idea of taking a bunch of money to try and grow our guest base while the host base didn't keep up was always something that we were afraid of and didn't want to push.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you estimate the lifetime value of a typical member?
The typical member would probably only have a membership for 2 years, somewhere in that vicinity, because they, it was some people retire and then they're full-time RVers for 5 or 10 years, but the average RVer is probably only going to do that for a year or two before they feel they've seen everything, and then they settle down.
Yeah Okay, got it. So a couple hundred or $100 of lifetime value would have been a classic. So clearly you can't spend a ton to acquire customers at that rate. So you had this, you mentioned your mom's travel guide list was how many, 12,000 or something people on that? How many were on that list? Do you remember?
Oh, I don't know how many people were on that list to begin with. At the time when we launched, though, we had about 200 hosts who signed up sort of from that initial list. So,
from that initial, okay, yeah. Got it. So once you'd exhausted the lists from the Frugal travel guides, how did you then go about acquiring members beyond that? Like, what other techniques did you try?
So we were very, very naive at the beginning and very much thought that they would come and find us.
The old field of dreams. If you build it, they will come.
That's right.
Strategy. Never heard that before.
No. Clearly it didn't really work to any great degree. But we did have enough traction that, a few guests would find us. And the RV community is really, like I've said, very tight-knit, very word of mouth. And, every time you go camping somewhere and, end up meeting your neighbor and having a beer around a campfire, the first thing that they ask is, oh, where have you come from and where are you going? So, the conversation often would say, oh, I just stayed at this great, Boondockers Welcome host. And that would, precipitate the, oh, what's that? And so as much as it's very hard to measure, I know that the word of mouth avenue is really a large part responsible for our growth.
Got it. I'm completely ignorant. What is a boondocker?
So, the boondocks would be like the middle of nowhere. Yeah, so okay. If you're boondocking, the traditional term would mean camping without any hookups, right? You don't have electrical power, you don't have any water. When we started Boondockers Welcome, we kind of expected it to be people boondocking in each other's driveway. Sort of dry camping is another word that gets used for it. As it turned out, a lot of our hosts actually offer electric or water hookups. Some of them even put in like RV pads for their Boondockers Welcome guests because they enjoy having them so much.
But you can see, I'm not surprised that the word of mouth was the accelerant, though, because to your point, I'd imagine there's a fairly tight-knit community, and there's definitely some word of mouth going on. So interesting. So how big did you get this company before you first sort of thought about selling it?
So we reached a point where I considered selling back in about 2019. And at that point, we had about $100,000 in ARR.
Annual recurring revenue, for people who don't know that acronym.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, good.
I can't remember how many hosts we might have had at that time, maybe 1,500 hosts, and probably in the like 5,000 or 6,000 guests range, maybe a little less than that. Mm-hmm. And at that time, my mother, who, you know, is obviously older than me, was 67 years old and was looking to retire. And sort of, we enjoyed running the company, but she was still traveling and sort of just wanted to be able to do that. We were still a company of two at that point. She handled all of the customer support, all of sort of the business development relationships with other RVing companies that we had developed, all of our social and marketing, and I was still doing all of the technical work. And I wasn't really sure how I felt about, you know, replacing her with somebody else. And at that point, we thought we might just sell, and that would be a way to sort of both exit and you know, not hurt our relationship at all and not have to worry about any other messiness. And we had a gentleman who runs a company in the RV space who had reached out to us a couple of times asking if we were at all interested. And sort of he happened to reach out one more time just as we were sort of coming to this, well, maybe it's time moment. And so we did actually go down the road at that time. This was in 2019 of thinking of selling. So like I said, we had about $100,000 a year in revenue, and the offer that he came back at was about 3.9 times our ARR. And I actually met with Thomas Smale from FE International, an M&A advisor. I met him at a conference that I was at, and sort of they, you know, went over those numbers and said, and we actually had our own accountants as well, who sort of went over those numbers and said, yeah, that's a very reasonable offer based on your ARR and your growth. So we had the letter of intent in hand, and we're about to sign it. And then that conference that I went to, actually, it was MicroConf. I just sort of got really reinvigorated while I was there and decided not to sell. So I came home and told my mom that I wasn't going to let her sell it.
Wow. Okay. So I got lots of questions there. So for folks who don't know MicroConf, that's Rob Walling's conference. It's for mostly bootstrapped SaaS companies and apps. Great conference. I've heard amazing things about it. So it sounds like you had a great experience there.
I did, definitely. It was, life-changing. And I had a lot of great conversations and met a lot of people who were sort of looking to reach, to have an idea or a business that had anywhere near this. You know, it certainly wasn't a phenomenal success. $100,000 a year for two people is, you know, barely enough to put food on the table. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it wasn't, it was my full-time job, but I have a spouse who has a good job. So it wasn't replacing my computer engineering salary at that point. But but I had a lot of vision when I came back that we could grow it even further. And I, you know, took a lot of the pointers that I learned at MicroConf and put them into practice. And I did hire someone to take over all of the customer support responsibilities. And then I took on, you know, some of the financial and business development responsibilities from my mom, so she could essentially step back from the day-to-day. And we continued like that for another 2 years. And at that point, I didn't buy her out. I did consider that. And, but we just decided that I would take a salary and she would stay on as a 50% equity holder.
Okay. That was going to be a question. Did you ever consider taking the 3.9, placing the valuation at whatever, 400 grand and saying, okay, here's a check to 200 grand, mom?
Yeah, it definitely did occur to us. And, but I mean, in retrospect, I'm quite glad I didn't, only because when you do sell a company, if you have bought out a previous co-founder and they haven't essentially gained from that, you know, that higher sale price than what you bought them out for, I feel like there would be some difficult relationship moments. And if it had just been, you know, a co-founder, that would have been one thing, but it was my mom.
Yeah. One of the many complexities of being in business with a parent, right? Or a family member of any sort is exactly right. You buy them out and 2 years later you go on and sell for 3 times more. You kind of feel like a bit of a heel. Makes Thanksgiving dinner a little bit a little bit treacherous.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. What was your mom's reaction when you came back from MicroConf and you're like, we're not selling?
I think I must have dropped enough hints when I was, coming back to let her know that was probably going to happen. We invited her over for dinner, and I said, nope, we're not going to sell. And she said, yeah, I thought that might be what you were going to say. I think she was fine with it, right? I mean, I think it wasn't about the money that would have come in from that sale at all. It was more just about, a relief of the responsibilities that she was looking for. And I was still, willing to offer that. So that was fine for her.
What was the reaction of the acquirer who had made the offer of 3.9 when you told him we're not selling?
He was disappointed, clearly. I mean, I don't think, lawyers hadn't, or at least we hadn't gotten any lawyers involved. I know he had done a couple of acquisitions before. So he, I think, had some people that helped put his letter of intent together or whatever, but I don't think he was out of pocket a whole ton of money for having, lost that opportunity.
So what is it that you learned at the MicroConf conference that you came to start to apply to the business? In other words, how did you improve its value over time?
Well, I mean, part of it was entirely mental and just getting over my own imposter syndrome stumbling blocks. The idea that I couldn't hire somebody was something that had sort of weighed on me, that I didn't want to be somebody's boss. And then I came back and realized this is not that hard. I can do this. And so that wasn't really necessarily something I learned. It was just something that I sort of felt as I realized and talked with other people that they don't have some superpower that I don't. But as far as actually building the business, we raised our prices, almost immediately, or, it took a little while to get that in order. But that was one of the biggest pieces of advice that every MicroConf, I think, seems to harp on. But it's like the levers that you have to increase your revenue, raising your prices is the easiest one. And we were already, I think at that point, we were only charging $30 a year, which was really underpriced. And
what was the membership's reaction to the increase in price? You recall, I mean, it was much different scale, obviously, but when Netflix a couple of years ago went to raise their price unilaterally, it basically caused the internet to break. There were so many people who were outraged that Netflix would do that. You're obviously different business, but what was your members' reaction?
The fact that we had such a sort of low lifetime value, meaning that we didn't actually get that many years of renewal out of each customer, meant that it actually wasn't a bad business decision for us to just grandfather in all our current customers. And in addition, churn happens a lot because people don't necessarily know if they're going to continue traveling. And so they wouldn't renew their membership. But we grandfathered in current members at their existing $30 a year price and promised that as long as they didn't let their membership lapse, they could keep that price. So that really actually helped bump up that lifetime value because people would continue to renew even though they weren't sure if they were going to be traveling that year.
Yeah, the old fear of missing out strategy, right? You're like, oh, well, if you churn and you come back, it's going to cost you almost twice as much. So got it. So you grandfathered in the guys and gals at 30 a year, excuse me. And then for new people, you went to 50. You got over the imposter syndrome. I find this fascinating because I think there are two types of entrepreneurs. Like there are some entrepreneurs who are very comfortable hiring and they're like, yeah, of course I'm going to hire it. Like I'm not doing it myself. And I get that sort of persona. There is this other personality type, and maybe you could speak to this, where, gosh, that first employee is like this commitment, right? Now I'm responsible for someone else's mortgage, and it's this big kind of. How did you get over that hump?
I think a lot of it came to realizing that, putting in place the processes and checklists and having some good onboarding would help me feel a little relieved from that. And since we were essentially replacing, my mother's job with the customer support role, I mean, we had a lot of, canned answers and things like that already in place. It wasn't that difficult for us to sort of put together, a bit of an onboarding and some training. And once I realized that, if I did that, then even if that support person didn't work out, I would still have that and I would be able to do it again and hire another person to take over that role. And I think both my mother and I suffer a little bit from just perfectionism and not thinking that anybody else is going to do it the right way.
Yeah, you're control freaks.
A little bit. But I was able to convince her that, as long as we are willing to pay enough money, we can find somebody who is absolutely skilled enough to do this. We knew we weren't going to outsource our customer support to some Indian call center because we've got a lot of senior citizens in our customer base and, American red-blooded, not really interested in talking to somebody with a foreign accent about how to RV travel. It's unfortunately a very homogeneous customer base. And so it was really important to us to have, somebody local to North America who understood RVing. And we actually ended up hiring that customer support person from our membership. We, put out in our newsletter, we said, we're hiring a customer support person. We had 200 applicants for the job. So, and this was obviously pre-pandemic. We said, you can work remotely, you can work from your RV, you can make your own hours. We sort of, only requested that they check in a couple of times a day to answer support requests. It's not a business. It's not a B2B business. So we know that our customers are not generally, knocking down our door with, important things that need to be answered in the next 10 minutes. So a 24-hour turnaround was fine. So we were offering a really flexible working environment and it was really appealing. And yeah, we hired an amazing customer support person originally just on a part-time contract for 15 hours a week. And she eventually came on full-time as sort of our community director. She also had a marketing background. So she took on a lot of our marketing responsibilities as well. It was a great decision.
Amazing. So again, things that you did to improve the value of your company. Number one, you raised prices. Number two, you hired to take this, some of the customer support piece and marketing piece off your shoulders. What else did you do to improve the business after MicroConf?
We had already started, using social media a lot, not necessarily, Facebook posts, but we had found Facebook groups worked really well for us, sort of giving the RV community a specific place to discuss our offering just amongst themselves. And that worked really, really well. And we sort of doubled down on that a lot. Just more conscious moderating and trying to funnel people towards that Facebook group. And that actually really helped drive sales
to be clear, these were groups that you created and hosted and moderated?
Yes. So we created and hosted and moderated the group, but we tried to be very hands-off and sort of just let the other members sell it for us because they were amazing at that.
Got it. That's super helpful. So the Facebook groups were great. The onboarding, the customer support person, raising prices. Anything else that you did that improved the business, its value?
I think we were already sort of doing this prior to MicroConf, but one of the biggest drivers of just sales every week was a newsletter that we sent out that, we had played around with different newsletter formats over the years, but we finally settled on essentially a newsletter that was just, here are the 10 or whatever, the 20 new hosts who've signed up in the last week. And that was just a huge driver for sales every week. We would see a giant spike in that because it was easy to read.
it's like you can imagine, oh, I could go to like Oxford County, Ohio, and there's this great village that looks over this hilltop. And like you could really it would be fun to look forward to that, even though you have no plans to go to that place.
Exactly. I would look through them every week. And some of them, that the pictures were just, mind blowing, just, this horse in a field with mountains in the background. And you're like, oh my gosh, I could stay there for free. So it sold itself.
I want to opt in for the newsletter. Do you guys still do the newsletter? I'm like, where do I opt in for the newsletter?
I don't think all the new hosts are in the newsletter anymore.
It's a bummer.
Our acquirers have put the new hosts a little bit behind a paywall, I think. So
okay, so let's get into that. So you're making these changes, and what impact's it having on sales? When you had the first offer, you're at about 100,000 in ARR. It sounds like you got it up from there when you started to sell it a second time.
Yeah, we more than doubled our growth every year for the next 2 years until we did sell. So both hosts, number of hosts, as well as number of guests, which obviously we need to grow both sides of the marketplace to make that happen. So it was partially those changes that we put into effect, but I mean, there was also huge market forces that really helped give us some headwinds. Yeah,
we've already talked about the pandemic. Yeah. So 100 to 200, 200 to 400. So you were sort of, if I'm reading between the lines, kind of like $500,000 to $1 million of ARR, that sort of space. I don't know.
Yeah, that sort of ballpark. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that's great. So really a dramatic improvement over the first 9 years, because it was 9 years to get to 100,000.
I think seven years to get to that 100,000. But like I said, that was very much a side project for the first 5 years of those 7.
Okay.
So
okay. But it's considerable growth at a relatively mature stage of the business, which is exciting to see for folks who are slamming their heads against the wall thinking, is this ever going to work? Is this ever going to work? I think the message, at least you would deliver, or from your example, is that you've got to stick to it for a relatively long time before.
I mean, being able to put in more time and effort, obviously, I think we could have moved the needle earlier than we did. But when I was able to, for me personally, it was when my kids started school full time, I was able to really focus on the business more. And that was sort of, from 2017 to 2019, we went from probably 30K to 100K ARR. So that was a pretty decent swing up as well. And then up and to the right from there.
So what was the trigger that made you decide to sell the second time, if I can use that term?
Yeah. So, things were going well. We were probably reaching a point where we should start thinking of hiring more people. It was still just myself and Carrie, who I had hired to replace my mom. And the market, like we've talked about, had, really, really gone nuts. And I was approached by Joel Holland, who is the CEO of Harvest Hosts. We had a friendly relationship for a few years, sort of just keeping in touch. Harvest Hosts is another sort of alternative camping offering. They orchestrate stays at wineries and breweries, and also work on sort of a membership model like we did. So it was a very complementary product. We had like reciprocal discounts with each other and had that for years. About 50% of our members were also members in Harvest Hosts. So when he approached us in early 2021 and asked if we were interested in selling, my initial reaction was, no, we're having too much fun, which was pretty much my standard line for everybody who asked at that point. But he was persistent and, said, name your number, which I know is not really the thing you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to name your number. But at the same time, my mother was pushing 70 and, she and I were both still taking dividends from the company. We weren't I took a salary, we took dividends as well, but we weren't funneling a lot of money back into the company, partly because I knew that this was sort of funding my mother's retirement to some degree. So the idea that, this could be peak RV, I don't know. We were very much in a very, very RV positive atmosphere at that point. And I know that sort of this is my mom's whole nest egg, essentially. And I didn't want, part of me worried that, we had something that was a very valuable asset at this point, and I didn't want to go over the peak. I had heard, too many stories about other founders who, said no when I think Rand Fishkin told the story in his Lost and Founder book about, going over just riding over the peak and getting a great offer and saying, no, I think we can get way more than that. And obviously we weren't anywhere near the level that he was in that story, but it resonated with me. And I thought, I don't want to ride this over the top. And so when that offer came, and again, it was such a good synergy for that particular acquirer, it seemed like a natural time to just go ahead.
Got it. And so did you have any sense of what it might be worth? So clearly you're now, $500,000 in ARR or more, and you'd already had an offer of 4 times revenue. So I'm assuming you're starting to do the math and thinking, okay, this is definitely a 7-figure business, exit I'm looking at. It could be be bigger. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had kept in touch with FE International, the brokers who we had talked to prior. And they had sort of done annual evaluations based on our P&L statements. And so I had a good idea of what it was worth from that perspective, from a, ARR times some kind of multiple perspective.
What multiple ARR were they saying?
It was, I get still in like that 3 to 4 range. So,
got it.
But I also recognize that multiple is probably more aimed at, a private equity or somebody who's looking to buy it for financial reasons. Whereas this was obviously more of a strategic growth opportunity that Harvest Host was looking for. I knew they had just taken a bunch of funding. They had announced a $37 million round only a few months prior to that. So, I knew they had a bunch of money to spend, and the reason for their purchase was they had, about 3,000 winery hosts. And I knew that they would essentially want to add our hosts to that mix in some way to essentially increase their footprint. So it was definitely a strategic buy. So I knew that, our multiple would be able to be substantially bigger than that, 3 to 4.
Yeah, it's interesting when a strategic acquirer, a company you think has a really good, a good rationale to buy your company, raises a truckload of money, like $37 million. I think there's sort of 2 things that can happen. One is that they've got a war chest to go buy your business, which clearly you hoped and thought that Joel was clearly coming to you thinking, with that intent. The other side, though, is that they've got a war chest to compete with you. And if you don't nibble on the offer, it could mean that, okay, fine, well, the gloves are off. We're going to go do something on our own to compete with you. Did that cross your mind that Joel would take that $37 million and create his own version of Boondockers Welcome?
Maybe briefly, but we had a very good brand and very devoted customer and host base. They, like I said, they were the lifeblood of our business, and we had a moat, really, that, the brand that we had built was substantial. And I knew that. And during the acquisition process, the due diligence process, Harvest Hosts actually, went and did their own sort of survey, and our NPR scores were through the roof. And we, hadn't made a habit of doing NPR surveys regularly, but it didn't surprise me at all.
When you say NPR, I'm used to the acronym NPS, Net Promoter Score. Do you mean NPS?
Yes. No, sorry. That is what I mean. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Cool. I just want to make sure for our listeners that we're talking the same language. Got it. So they did an NPS. Did they do it with both the hosts as well as the members?
Yes.
And where did you see the greatest moat? Was it with the hosts or more the members?
Both. I think the hosts are much more loyal, because some of our hosts had been hosts for the better part of a decade,
and harder to I can imagine it'd be harder to replace, because the members kind of come and go. People get interested in RVing and they kind of lose interest. But the hosts, that's a very attractive asset, I would think, and hard to just kind of replicate overnight.
And that was, I think, the hardest part about selling. Was we knew that if we were going to sell, we needed to sell to somebody who was going to protect and take care of our hosts in a way that didn't destroy that asset. And I mean, obviously, it's out of my hands once I've sold it, but what we built has, personal meaning to us as well. So we didn't want to see it dismantled or sent in a direction where the hosts no longer felt valued. How
did you ensure they were going to feel valued? I mean, did you do paper something with Joel, like a legal protections so that he couldn't do certain things, or was it just a handshake deal? Like, how did you protect the hosts?
We didn't do anything written in that regard. And I mean, maybe in retrospect, we should have. But I got a very good feeling from Joel, and throughout the entire process, it was, he was very much a man of his word. And essentially we were promised that Boondockers Welcome would be kept as its own sort of brand and tier. The Harvest Hosts did, integrate them together in that you can buy a Harvest Host membership, and for an upgrade, you can also get a Boondockers Welcome membership. So they, they've got that expansion revenue opportunity, and they had a much larger customer base than us. So lots of people to send towards that expansion revenue. But keeping those as separate entities was part of that negotiation, just so that our hosts who, weren't making any money, as opposed to Harvest hosts are usually, like I said, wineries, and the expectation there is that you're going to come in and buy a bottle of wine, right? They're doing this as a business, a small businesses trying to improve their revenue stream. But we knew that we didn't want our hosts to feel like they were suddenly being treated as a commodity, that, we didn't want the guests who show up at a winery and say, I've paid you, I've bought my bottle of wine, now I can, not even say thank you. For our hosts, it was much more about, just having honest social interactions and, gratitude from their guests.
Makes sense. So Joel says, name your number. What'd you say?
Well, I said, I'll get back to you. At that point, I had an internal number in my head at one point, and I pretty much, multiplied that by 2.5. But I also went, we have a friend of my husband's actually, who he went to university with, who is now the CEO of a venture-backed startup and has, just a lot of knowledge about valuations and sort of, was able to sit there and think, well, if I was acquiring you, what would my payback period be and what would I be willing to pay? And, I feel like, this is actually a pretty reasonable number. And so I did actually go back with a number, and I said, this is what we're looking for. And it was something that my mother and I obviously had discussed and said, we couldn't say no to that number.
So I have to ask, what was the number? Every listener of the show is going, you got to ask, John, what was your magic number?
It was mid 7 figures is what I will say. And they came back to it was very, very close to that. So we were happy. And like I said, we said, yeah, if they reach this, then we can't really say no. So we said yes.
Okay. So a couple questions. This is a goofy question, but when you went back to Joel with the dream number, was it in writing or did you speak it to him? Did you orally say it's X million dollars or did you email him?
I just wrote it in an email. I think that's all it was a number in an email. And he, of course, now has a board because he's got funding. So he had to go take it to the board and get approval. And, they did their own valuation and came back and said, well, based on this is a generous based on our valuations. This is, I think his words were, it's like, it's better valuation than we got when we raised money. So I kind of felt like if he's being truthful there, then we're doing okay.
Yeah, I think you did. So you didn't really get a sense from Joel about his reaction. One of the beauties of throwing out a number in person is you can see the body language of the acquirer. Like if they kind of lurch backwards and throw their eyes up in the air thinking they're, but in an email, you don't get the bet. Did he respond at all with any sense of whether he thought that was anywhere close to being what they would pay?
I think he essentially just said, I'm going to have to go talk to my board and get back to you. And honestly, I see what you're saying about the in-person, but I felt like there's a bit of a double-edged sword there. And I wasn't sure how confident and strong-willed and poker-faced I would be able to be in that conversation. So the email was definitely the way for me.
Yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting you do it in person. I just was saying I was curious about his physical reaction to receiving it, but obviously over email, you can't. That's great. One of the things that I've heard from a lot of other guests is the moment they send an email like that, the clock starts ticking and they start to get nervous, right? If they don't get a response after a day, they think the deal's off. And then if they don't get a response for 3 days, it's like, oh, what did I do? I've totally overshot this. And then a week goes by and they still haven't got an email. And then they're like, I didn't really mean that number, what we would really accept. And then they're negotiating with themselves. And like, did you get into that that sense of sitting on your hands, waiting for Joel to respond?
I think our, best alternative to a negotiated agreement was just not selling. So, and continuing as we hadn't sought out this offer. And so for me, I was able to sort of say, I'm just going to walk away and not check my email for the next 24 hours and not stress about it. And I don't think he left us hanging too long. But yeah, I didn't really second guess that.
How did you and your mom arrive at the number, this sort of dream number? Was she involved in, I'm assuming as a 50% shareholder, she was very much involved. How did it, take me inside the room and when you and your mom are talking about that?
Well, like I said before, I had sort of this, valuation from the brokers that we talked to about, based on ARR and growth rates, that this is what the number would be. And I knew that wasn't enough. I knew that, it was, at this point, it was March. So this is, just before the travel season really takes off. It's a very, seasonal business. You do most of your revenue between like May and August. Yeah. And so, I knew that there was significant increase in that ARR coming still, right? The year before, our ARR had actually taken a significant hit during the beginning of the pandemic when everybody, hunkered down and didn't do anything. So that number was already, a little bit depressed because of that. So we sort of took all those things into consideration and to some degree just kind of said, wouldn't it be nice to have this much money and not have to run this business anymore? So we did. We had lots of, at that point, it was still pretty lockdown COVID-y. So, a lot of Zoom conversations about that back and forth. And it was pretty easy for us to agree that, if this number is great, and if they hit that, then we're willing to go ahead. And otherwise, we'll just continue doing what we're doing.
So Joel came back at a number close to could you give me a percentage basis of how close? Like, was it 95% of the number, 90%, 80%?
It was like 95%.
Wow. So okay. So pretty, okay, great. And how was it structured? Was it 100% cash? Was it a portion of earnout, or were you asked to carry equity into Harvest Host? Like, what was the structure?
Yeah. So it was pretty much all cash. It was, about 80% upfront on closing day, and the other 20% over monthly over a 6-month transition period, just essentially contingent on us being available during those 6 months to make sure the transition went smoothly. But there was no earnout, no, acqui-hire. I wasn't expected to stay on past that 6 months. And Joel knew that obviously my mom had already sort of tapped out, and that I had told him previously that if I ever sold, it wouldn't be because I, wanted to keep the money and stay on. It would be because I was interested in moving on to something else.
Yeah. That makes good sense. Well, it sounds like an incredible deal. I mean, getting out with 6-month consulting contracts, I mean, that's a pretty sweet deal. And I think a lot of people listening to this would be like, I want that. So
yeah, I was pretty pleased about that for sure.
Yeah, I should imagine. Hey, are you willing to do our due diligence little lightning round of questions here?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a quick question. I'm looking for a quick answer, and I won't do any follow-up questions. I just want to know your kind of gut reaction to a couple of questions before I let you go. What is the slimiest trick an acquirer tried to pull over on you?
Gosh, I don't know. I feel like we've had good experiences with acquirers. I don't want to accuse anybody of being slimy. Just, I think
any of those VCs that came knocking on your door, sort of.
I probably just asking you to be quicker in your response than you're really comfortable being.
Biggest mistake you made in the selling process?
Not nailing down how many hours a week I was consulting for. It was a broad, you'll be paid X a month for your consulting services without any sort of, I would do it as an hourly contract in the future.
Great tip. What was the lowest emotional point you reached during the exit process?
Trying to deal with New York lawyers funded by venture capital acquirers of our investors of our acquirers, just trying to stomp all over my, Canadian lawyer. There was a moment where, they're in the States, we're in Canada, there's all sorts of jurisdictional questions. And there was like lots of, you should be adhering to American laws and all of these things. And my lawyer was very much, you cannot guarantee that you have adhered to an American law because you're a Canadian company. And we were only selling the assets. We weren't actually selling the corporation. So, So there was a lot of back and forth, and there were some low moments there where I was like, this is just all going to blow up because, their lawyers refused to accept the fact that we're a Canadian company.
Highest emotional point you reached during the selling process?
I think knowing that my one employee was brought on board and given a really great role and a pay increase, and I think and a promotion, and that even now, we keep in touch, and I know she's it's been a great opportunity for her, and that was really important to me.
One thing you wished you had known, someone had pulled you aside and told you before you went through the selling process?
If you're considering raising your prices, do it sooner rather than later, because that makes a huge difference in your revenue numbers that are going to affect what you're actually going to be able to get. Don't wait.
What resources did you look at to educate yourself about the exit planning process? Was there an online course, a conference? You mentioned MicroConf was super helpful. Is there anything else in the way of resources that you drew from?
Well, your book, John, both your books, the Art of Selling Your Business, I certainly read during this whole process. And
great.
Built to Sell, I had listened to the audiobook version of that several years prior, but definitely, that, and I think Chris Voss's negotiation book. I'm trying to remember what it's called.
Never Split the Difference. A great book. It's super good. Yeah. Chris Voss is amazing. If you watch him on YouTube too, he's excellent. Anything else that you could point people to? Any online courses or anything, any authors? Chris Voss. Thank you for the compliment, by the way. Chris Voss is amazing. Anyone else?
Honestly, I can't think of, I'm trying to think I feel like Tyler Tringus, I think, has, a blog post just about how he sold.
He's been on Built to Sell Radio.
Yeah.
We'll put that in the show notes. It's a great interview.
Yeah. So he had some great sort of pointers, and I looked for that both for, the prior acquisition offer we had as well. That was a great a resource.
Great. And we've also mentioned a couple of folks today. Rob Walling, who sold Drip has been on the show. We'll put that in the show notes at builttosell.com, as well as Rand Fishkin, Lost and Founder, has been on the show. So we'll put all those in links in the show notes for this episode, because those are really, you've referenced those, and they're great stories as well to listen to. Final question. What trophy did you buy yourself to celebrate and commemorate this achievement?
Yeah, the sad truth is I bought my kids some laptops, and I haven't really bought myself anything. We did buy a family VR headset, but my goal is to buy us a trip somewhere. But with COVID, we haven't really been ready to travel yet. So that's the future big expense that we're.
Next time we do this, I want to hear that you have a trophy that you can point me towards that commemorates this. You can't do all this incredible and not have something that you can point to physically to commemorate the amazing accomplishment. You've had this great success. What are you doing now? Are you fully retired, or are you on to a new thing? What's next?
So retirement is it's too early. I still have school-aged kids. I don't know what I would do with myself all day if I was retired. So I'm starting another business, and
cool.
Unlike this one, which sort of, like I said, we were very naive and didn't know what we were doing. I feel like this time I've got a little more clarity, and I'm building a B2B marketing SaaS. Essentially, one of the problems that I discovered while we were running Boondockers Welcome was just the number of email subscribers who didn't complete the confirmation step in their double opt-in. So my business SubscribeSense tries to help businesses increase that confirmation rate for their email lists.
Cool. Very discrete application, very, very specific, but very easy to understand. So that's at subscribesense.com.
Yep.
.com. Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes at builttosellradio.com. Anna Maste, this was super fun. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It was really a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Anna Maste. For show notes, including links to everything we referenced in today's episode, Rand Fishkin's episode, Rob Walling's episode, Tyler Tringus, just go to builttosell.com and search out the episode page. Hey, if you're wondering how you can support the show, the best thing you can do is nominate a guest, builttosellradio.com/nominate. The other thing you can do is consider rating the show on any of the big podcasting platforms. While you're there, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Today's show was produced by Haley Parkhill. Special thanks to Dennis Labataglia for audio and video engineering. And thank you to the entire community of certified value builders who help us bring our message to you. I will be back in your earbuds next week. Thanks again for listening.